So, Barzini will move against you first. He'll set up a meeting with someone that you absolutely trust, guaranteeing your safety. And at that meeting, you'll be assassinated. I like to drink wine more than I used to. Anyway, I'm drinking more.
It's good for you, Pop.
I don't know. Your wife and children, are you happy with them?
Very happy.
That's good. Hope you don't mind the way I keep going over this Barzini business.
No, not at all.
It's an old habit. I spend my life trying not to be careless. Women and children can be careless, but not men. How's your boy?
He's good.
You know, he looks more like you every day.
He's smarter than I am. 3 years old, he can read the funny papers.
Read the funny paper. I want you to arrange to have a telephone man check all the calls that go. You know,
I did it already, Pop.
You know, could be
Pop,
anyone.
I took care of that.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
What's the matter? What's bothering you? I'll handle it. I told you I can handle it. I'll handle it.
Hey everybody, it's time for Taste of Torah, and I thought I would begin with one of the classic scenes of a father offering his close to death advice to his son, because it sets up a contemporary popular version of what we're going to be looking at today, because we are going to be looking at the very last portion of the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit, and it's called Vayechi, meaning and the life of, and it was the life of Jacob. So actually our Torah portion deals with two deaths, the death of our ancestor Joseph and the death of his father Jacob. And there's a lot going on, and well worth considering. It's a very interesting portion because in it Jacob offers his, as it were, deathbed blessings and predictions for his children, just as Don Corleone is trying to anticipate the future for his son, so it is that Jacob talks about the future of his 12 sons. And it's a great moment. Now, the speech by Don Corleone is probably a little closer to David's deathbed speech, where he's advising Solomon to make sure he keeps his enemies close. And in fact, that is our Haftarah portion. So if you want to read the Haftarah, you'll read a very interesting twofold narrative where King David invokes the authority of Torah and telling his son to be righteous and upright, but then also advises him to dispose of certain political enemies as soon as David is dead. In any case, that's not what Jacob does, but there are some wonderful big ideas in our Torah portion. So I'd like to call attention to this. Oh, before I do, let me mention one interesting little aspect of the way Judaism has interpreted the story of Jacob. Now, Jacob is clearly in decline. He is, as we would say, ill, facing his own mortality. And reading the Torah very narrowly, some of our ancestors in writing commentaries suggest that Jacob is really the first person to ever experience illness, because no illness is ever mentioned in the Torah for any of the generations prior to Jacob. So that's a little narrower than we normally do. Jews prefer to acknowledge that there are things going on outside the Torah that may not be addressed by the Torah. But in this particular case, supposedly Jacob is the first sick person ever. I wouldn't bank much on that. But in any case, so Jacob is on his deathbed, and he speaks to his son Joseph and about his grandsons, just as Don Corleone asks about his grandson. And then we have Jacob gather all the sons together and give a series of speeches about each and every one of them that really sort of border on prophecy, predicting their future. Now, Jewish tradition would say that at least for a short period of time, Jacob had the gift of prophecy. I think modern scholars tend to think rather that what they have done is the author has taken the known fate of the different tribes and then put it into Jacob's mouth. So we're getting a snapshot of how the tribes were faring at a certain later date, and it's credited to the patriarch. Be that as it may, there are a couple of important big ideas going on in this Torah portion that I think are well worth paying attention to. The first of them is the idea of forgiveness, because once again, we find that the brothers are concerned that when Jacob dies, Joseph will feel like he has a free hand to punish his brothers, which again invokes the movie The Godfather, because it's Michael who refuses to move against his untrustworthy brother Fredo as long as his mother is alive. But the minute his mother passes away, Fredo is toast, or Fredo is food for the fishes, as it were. So in any case, the brothers think that way. They're thinking as cynically as the Corleone family. But in fact, Joseph reassures them that even though Jacob has died, he has forgiven them and that they should not fear. So the power of forgiveness, which would sustain this family and have sustained the Jewish people for the last 3,000 years, is highlighted here. In addition, I think it's worth noting the approach to death. Now, because they are living in an Egyptian context, we are told that after their death, both Jacob and Joseph are mummified. This is the Egyptian custom in ancient times. The body would be preserved with the idea of it being preserved for all times, because the body would apparently be needed in the afterlife. Whereas the traditional Jewish custom is to accept death and accept that we are not going to have a future until such time as God miraculously declares we should. And so it is an interesting contrast. I think everybody in the Jewish commentators observes mummification. They're engaged in mummification because we believe in the tradition of ashes to ashes, dust to dust, that the body should be allowed to return to the earth and return to the cycle of biological life and death, just as all other creatures do, all other plants, all other animals. So it's a fundamentally different view. It's not that there is no afterlife for Jews. Of course, at the very least, our component parts will go into whatever new life emerges from them. But we go even further than that. Nevertheless, I thought it would be interesting to make a contrast. So we've got forgiveness, we've got notions of what it means to die and the afterlife. But I think probably for us today, there are two interesting points. Point one is that the brothers take both Jacob and later Joseph Oh no, take Jacob. Joseph remains buried in Egypt until the time of Moses. They take their father Jacob back to the land of Israel. Now, the unaddressed question is, why didn't they stay? If they were going to go to all the trouble to go back to the land of Israel to bury their father, this was the land that was promised to them, but they choose not to. Well, they are living in what we today would call a diaspora, outside the land, connected to the land, but outside the land. And it's a good life. And so they decide that they are going to return to the land of Egypt. Now, as we all know, this is not a happily ever after story. Within a generation, our ancestors, the descendants of Jacob's children, will be enslaved and will have the drama of the Exodus, which will unfold in the next book. However, for now, life is good, and there seems to be no need to go back and claim the promise that God had made for them. So, look at right from the very beginning of our people's history, we have lived in many different places. And you and I, even though we have a land of Israel that would be welcoming to us, we would be secure, we would be part of the majority, we choose to live in America or England or France or Japan or wherever we find ourselves because it's amenable, it's economically viable, it's comfortable, and there's nothing wrong with that per se. That is part of the Jewish experience. We are an international people, more than perhaps any other people in the world. The old anti-Semitic code phrase for us is that we're cosmopolitan. That is, that we are creatures of the world and not necessarily of a single country, and therefore we're suspect for being unloyal or less than loyal. And that's the downside of that. But the fact of the matter is, we're a remarkably international people, a remarkably sophisticated people. That all begins here. And our ancestors affirmed the value of that by returning to the land of Egypt after they buried their father. On the other hand, the same events highlight the fact that we never lose our connection to this land, the land of Israel, Canaan, whatever you want to call it, and it's got so many different names now. The state of Israel, the land of Israel, the Levant, southern Syria, Palestine. It's undergone many, many different names over time, but our connection to it remains continuous. That's because it's our sacred land. Now, we picked up somewhere in the 18th or 19th century the phrase Holy Land, which is really a Christian term, just as the term Palestine is really a Western Christian characterization of the land we call Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel. So too the phrase Holy Land is something that we borrowed from the Christians. However, I would use the term sacred land, and I use it the way the term is used among Native Americans, right? The first Americans here often speak of certain locations, Monument Valley or Two Bears Canyon, or some of the other places that have historically been their stomping grounds, as sacred land. And it means that it has more than simply the significance of possession. It represents a kind of mental homeland for Native Americans. There is a location called Blue Lake in northern New Mexico that is considered the sacred land of the Taos people, the Taos Pueblo people. And for many, many, many decades, it was held by the federal government, and The Taos people kept basically appealing to the federal government to restore the Blue Lake area to them because it was their sacred land. It's their sense of who they are and where their roots lie. And eventually, actually, it was Richard Nixon who gave it back to them. And I think that's appropriate. I think that was the right thing to do. And we too, as Jews, have the land of Israel as our sacred land. It is our historical origins. It is now restored as the Jewish state, the place where pretty much 50% of all Jews on the planet live. And as we live in the diaspora, it's virtually impossible to ignore. We refer to it, we think about it, we're uncomfortable with it, we rejoice in its successes, we are disturbed by its problems, but it is sacred to us. And our Torah portion reminds us of that. So probably the most important thing to see in the scope of all of these themes is the idea that we as a religious people are grounded. We're not living for a heaven, or we're not living for some abstract experience beyond our perceptions. That what is good, what is desirable, what is our hope, what is our future, is to be understood in the form of our children and grandchildren and their success, the scope of our lives, which will eventually end, but also our fundamental connection to the earth in general and to this sacred land of Israel in particular. We are a grounded people. That's part of the essence of our spirituality. We are not a salvific tradition. It's not like God is going to save us from the world, which is so often the theme in other religions, but rather this world is, I don't know, the central stage of salvation, the place in which the good of God is most manifest, and our connection to our land, to our descendants, these are at the heart of our spiritual experience of what it is to be a Jew. So this Torah portion, I think, highlights all of that. And regardless of whether we get ourselves mummified or not, I wouldn't do it, but you know, some people might choose to do that, just as some Jews might choose to have themselves burned in a Viking longboat after they die. Who am I to judge? But in any case, the point of the matter is that we are a people of the earth, a people who are grounded in the real experiences of this world, and that this is, to borrow a phrase from Voltaire, the best of all possible worlds when it comes to our spiritual well-being. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I look forward to talking with you next week.